Natalie had almost always been at the hospital with Liam recently, and Bryce had rarely been able to go there. Bryce had a lot of things to deal with. Natalie, too, was busy, and she didn't want Liam's illness to drag on for too long. She figured that testing Ronald's blood for a match with Liam's might help things along, and Liam had seemed to be a bit better lately, and this made Natalie feel a lot less worried, like she didn't have to worry too much about Liam. Liam had always been obedient and well-behaved. He only wanted to go out and play with Bryce. He certainly didn't want to encounter Ronald very often if he could avoid it. Ever since he received the call from Liam, Bryce could hardly breathe. He felt that he could no longer let things develop as they had been doing. He couldn't just remain passive. Bryce wouldn't just watch from the sidelines as Ronald snatched Natalie away from him with malicious intent. That was something he could not tolerate, and he had to act quickly. Thinking about this, Bryce had immediately put aside the documents that he was working on. He had then picked up his suit jacket and walked toward his office door. He pushed open the door vigorously, turning to the secretary. "Don't call me unless it's about something very important. Talk to the vice president to settle any other matters." The secretary looked at him in amazement. Where was the boss going in such a hurry? The secretary wondered. Bryce went down to the parking garage, got into his car, and drove away. Nothing was more important to him now than Natalie. He valued her more than any work matter. He looked at the empty passenger seat and thought of the times that Natalie had sat there, looking at him or talking. He shook his head to shake off the memories, which felt too painful to him at that moment. He drove fast and impatiently. His eyes were no longer calm, but instead filled with annoyance and urgency. His fingers were a little white as he tightly gripped the steering wheel, and his lips were dry with anxiety. He was in a rush to get to the hospital to do the things that he absolutely had to do. He sighed deeply. The temperature in the car wasn't that high, but for some reason, Bryce felt very hot and uncomfortable, and his breathing was labored. He opened the window and used one hand to undo his tie. But for some reason, perhaps because Bryce was in a hurry, the tie was tightly knotted and wouldn't come undone easily. Bryce started to feel even more annoyed. Through the open window, all the noise from outside assaulted his ears and made him feel tense and irritated. "That damned tie still won't come loose," he thought angrily. Bryce lowered his head and tried to look at himself in the vanity mirror so that he could see what was wrong with the tie knot. His attention was momentarily distracted from the road. Just when Bryce was finally winning his struggle with the tie knot, a large truck swerved across the road in front of him. The two cars were clearly about to collide. Bryce had no time to think and could only act on impulse. Luckily, Bryce's driving skills were very good. This fact, coupled with his fast reactions, meant that he was able to turn the steering wheel quickly and avoid a head-on collision with the big truck. Crash! The sound of an intense collision ran through the air. Luckily, Bryce's maneuver had avoided the worst-case scenario, and the truck had just struck his car with a glancing blow. But the weight of the truck still meant that Bryce's car suffered a very serious impact. Bryce's body jerked forward, and his head hit the steering wheel, stunning him. He saw stars, and his ears were ringing. He gasped in shock. He could feel his forehead starting to swell up immediately, and there was a warm trickle of blood running down his face. But all he could think about, even amid the chaos of the crash, were the people he loved who were at the hospital. They were his most important concern, and the situation with Liam, Natalie, and Ronald urgently needed to be resolved. Bryce quickly found a piece of paper. He wrote a quick note detailing his name, address, and cell number, and also wrote that he would cooperate with any investigation into the accident. "Please contact me," the note finished. He had to leave the scene of the crash, but he was quite prepared to take any responsibility that was due and to help the authorities deal with the situation. But not right now. He had to get to the hospital. Since Bryce couldn't delay with his current mission of getting to the hospital, he was going to do something that he thought was entirely reasonable. He was going to leave a note on his shattered windshield explaining who he was and how to contact him. This kind of quick thinking and pragmatism were among the reasons why so many of his subordinates were loyal to him, despite his personal chilliness. He was a reliable and smart boss to work for. In the past, Bryce had always been able to judge people accurately. He knew what each of his subordinates was good at and what their shortcomings were. It was one of Bryce's great skills to be able to put a suitable person into each individual position so that each person was able to play to their strengths and to do precisely what they were good at. After writing the note, Bryce opened the crumpled car door and got out, taking careful steps due to his dizziness from the blow on the head that he had received. He put the note under the windshield wiper to hold it down, then ran over to check that the driver of the truck was okay. The truck driver was shaken and apologetic, but he didn't seem to be injured. Bryce nodded in satisfaction, then turned to a woman at the front of the crowd that had gathered. "Hey," he said, "call the cops and recovery crew, will you? My details are on my windshield, and the cops can call me to talk. I have to get to the hospital. Thanks." He gave the woman $50 for her trouble, then hailed a taxi to take him to the hospital. It was not a long journey to the hospital from where the accident had occurred. Even though Bryce was clear-headed despite the crash, he was not in a very good condition physically right then. He was so determined to get to the woman he loved as fast as possible that he forgot about the wound on his forehead, but he couldn't ignore the discomfort it caused him. This made Bryce very unhappy. He used a lot of effort to shake his head, hold his forehead, and try to keep himself conscious and calm. While Bryce sat in the back of the taxi feeling dizzy, an image of Natalie and Ronald standing together and smiling at each other flashed into his mind. Bryce raged inside when he thought of this. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand to think about what Natalie and Ronald might do together while they were at the hospital. It wasn't that Bryce didn't trust Natalie. On the contrary, he was afraid because he knew her too well and trusted her too much. Bryce wasn't worried that Natalie had any evil intentions or schemes. What he was really afraid of was that Ronald would use Natalie to do some irreparable harm. Thinking about this, Bryce became a little scared. He immediately told the taxi driver to put her foot down, maximum speed. He wanted to get to Natalie as soon as possible. Even if she was unhappy, it didn't matter as long as she didn't get hurt. The car drove fast. Coupled with the wound on Bryce's forehead, it made him feel very uncomfortable and dizzy. His stomach was heaving. Fortunately, the ride didn't take long, and Bryce arrived at the hospital in quick time. He paid the driver and walked up to the hospital's entrance in a daze. After entering, Bryce went straight to the ward where Liam was. Bryce was very familiar with Liam's ward. He could have found it even with his eyes closed. In the past, when Bryce had come to see Liam, he had always had an uneasy feeling, afraid that Natalie would see him. But today was different. Liam had personally called Bryce and asked him to come. Even if Natalie is unhappy at my arrival and loses her temper with me, Liam would restrain her, Bryce thought. There was nothing Natalie could do about it. Thinking about this, the corner of Bryce's mouth rose in a smile. He ignored the fact that people around him were looking at the blood on his face from the head wound and gasping. The people who saw his frightening blood-stained appearance couldn't help but feel alarmed. Bryce smiled at the thought of letting a child like Liam act as his shield. Although it might be an understandable temptation, the fact was that Bryce still loved Natalie. He couldn't use someone Natalie cared about to hurt her. Bryce saw that the door to Liam's ward was open. He was surprised by this and thought that maybe something was wrong. He rushed into the ward without thinking. Ever since Liam had called Bryce, the person in the world he trusted the most after Natalie, Liam had stubbornly refused to lie down. He had used all of his tricks to persuade the nurses to leave the door to the ward open. Liam had been sitting on the bed, staring at the door and waiting for Bryce to appear. Finally, when Liam was about to give up hope, a frightening figure suddenly appeared at the door, a man with a blood-stained face, a man who was laughing breathlessly. Liam screamed. It was even more terrifying than seeing a ghost. Bryce looked at Liam and saw that, apart from being startled, the little boy was okay. He felt relieved. He quickly ran over to Liam, having closed the door behind him. "Liam, why aren't you lying down?" Bryce asked in a worried tone. He really cared about Liam. Liam had calmed down now after realizing that the bloody man was in fact Bryce, precisely who he had been wanting to see. "Dad, you've come," Liam said with relief. Then the nurse standing next to Liam's bed spoke. "Mr. Clare, Liam said that he would wait for you and that he wouldn't lie down to rest until you came. He even told me to open the door so that he could see you as soon as possible." Bryce nodded to the nurse politely. Then he turned to Liam. "Liam, "You can't behave like this ever again, or else Mom will be angry, and the nurses will be punished." But Bryce didn't really know whether to laugh or cry. Every time Liam committed a misdemeanor like this, Bryce felt a mixture of anger and amusement at Liam's cheekiness. Even though Liam was usually obedient, sometimes he couldn't help but be a little naughty, such as call Bryce on Natalie's phone and ask him to come over. Liam didn't really understand Bryce's words, but he trusted Bryce a lot and was willing to listen to what he said. Thus, after Bryce finished, Liam nodded obediently. Bryce's heart ached when he saw Liam's obedient appearance. Even though he was not his own child, but the child of someone he disliked, Bryce still loved Liam. Seeing the blood on Bryce's face, Liam took out a tissue from the box on the bedside and gently wiped Bryce's forehead. "Dad," he asked worriedly, "what has happened to you? Your forehead is bleeding. It looks so scary." The blood around the wound had spread out in all directions. It was pretty shocking to look at. However, Bryce didn't care at all. Although he could feel blood still flowing from his head, Bryce didn't think that it was serious. He knew that head wounds always tended to bleed a lot. He just ignored it and concentrated on Liam. Bryce, who had met with an accident on his way to the hospital, ignored his head injury and smiled down at Liam. "I'm fine," he reassured the little boy. "It's just a minor wound." Bryce smiled as he comforted Liam, trying to ease his worries, but the result was unsatisfactory. Liam was just a child and didn't have the same way of thinking as an adult. When he saw that someone he cared about was injured, he was naturally frightened. "Daddy, it must hurt," he said. "I'll clean up your wounds. That way it won't hurt anymore." Tears welled up in Liam's eyes, making them seem exceptionally sparkling and clear. He picked up a cotton wool ball from the table and carefully wiped the wound on Bryce's forehead. Having stayed in the hospital for so many days, Liam had learned how to treat wounds by watching what the nurses did. Seeing Liam's determined expression, Bryce did not resist. In order to make things easier for Liam, Bryce sat down on the bed with Liam right next to him. "I came over here in a hurry," said Bryce, "and I didn't bring you a present. You won't be angry with me, will you?" Bryce looked at Liam with a gentle and soft tenderness. If there was anyone in the world who could make Bryce adopt this kind of attitude, it was Liam. And Natalie, of course. Liam laughed. "Don't be silly. You've already brought me so many toys, so I don't care about getting more of them. And anyway, I can see that you got hurt rushing over to see me, and that makes me feel sad and guilty." Even at such a young age, Liam already had a pretty good vocabulary, and Bryce couldn't help but smile at the little boy's mannerisms. "It wasn't your fault that I got hurt in an accident," Bryce reassured Liam. "I wasn't concentrating like I should have been, and I didn't see the swerving truck until it was too late. Next time I see you, I'll definitely bring you something good." Bryce gently caressed Liam's head. The relationship between the two of them was very harmonious and sweet to look at. This kind of interaction was something that had never happened between Liam and Ronald, and that was one of the reasons why Liam didn't like Ronald very much. Ever since he had found out that Ronald was his real father, Liam's mood had become exceptionally bad, and he still had some doubts that what he'd been told about Ronald being his father wasn't actually the truth. If it turned out that, in reality, Bryce was actually Liam's real father, that would have been the perfect solution as far as Liam was concerned. Liam secretly hoped that his mother could get back together with Bryce. "Okay, Dad. Next time, I would like a picture book," Liam answered happily, still wiping Bryce's forehead with cotton wool. Meanwhile, Natalie had been accompanying Ronald as they walked toward Liam's ward. They arrived at the door just then and pushed the door open. When they entered, they saw Bryce sitting on the bed and Liam's hand dabbing at Bryce's forehead. The enmity between Ronald and Bryce meant that the situation immediately turned awkward. The two men looked at each other, and the atmosphere between them crackled with tension. Natalie looked at Liam with a frightened expression. She immediately realized what had happened. Needless to say, it must have been Liam who had asked Bryce to come over. However, when she looked at Bryce, Natalie felt awkward and uneasy. Her emotions were complicated, and she felt like there were tens of thousands of ants crawling all over her body. "What are you doing here?" she asked Bryce with a face full of doubt. Although she knew that Bryce came to the hospital to visit Liam from time to time, the fact that Ronald was here too made things seem much more complicated than usual. Bryce, who was still sitting next to Liam, opened his mouth to answer, but was interrupted by Liam's high-spirited voice. "Dad came to see me. He was in an accident and got injured." Liam's face showed a guilty expression. He had called his dad and asked him to hurry over, so he still felt that it was his fault that Bryce had been injured. When she heard Liam say that Bryce was hurt, Natalie immediately became concerned, but at the same time, she was a bit angry. Bryce was such a big person, and she didn't need him to protect her. She resented him coming over there at that time. "I'm just here to see Liam," Bryce said calmly, his face devoid of emotion. He didn't care about the injuries that he had suffered. But more importantly, he did care about Natalie's attitude toward him. As soon as Natalie had entered the room, she had seen that blood was still trickling from the wound on Bryce's forehead. Naturally, she felt a sympathetic pain in her heart. But now Bryce was sitting silently. This made Natalie feel especially worried. "Is your injury really okay?" Natalie asked with her face full of concern. Her heart ached as she looked at Bryce's face. There was a lot of concern showing in her words and expression. When Bryce detected Natalie's concern for him, his eyes lit up. The sad expression on his face turned into an excited one. So it turned out that Natalie still cared about him. She looked like she wanted to take care of him and comfort him when she saw that he was injured. Even though Bryce's heart was extremely touched by this realization, he pretended to be sad as he stared at Natalie. "I was really anxious about getting over here," he sighed melodramatically. "I was so anxious to see Liam that I didn't pay sufficient attention while driving. That's why I got injured. Help me bandage it up, would you?" Bryce adopted a beseeching expression. Natalie's words of concern and comfort had been enough to make his heart soar, but he still wanted more of her attention. He wanted as much of her as he could get. A troubled expression appeared on Natalie's face. She didn't know how to reject Bryce's passionate request. And with Ronald there, she didn't want to do anything with Bryce that would make Ronald jealous or angry. Natalie felt troubled. Liam suddenly urged Natalie to act, disrupting her train of thought. "Mom," cried the little boy, "please hurry up and bandage Dad's wounds. They're still bleeding." Liam's voice sounded extremely flustered. He couldn't wait for his mom to bandage his dad's head. But Liam had no idea of the kind of situation that he was sitting in the middle of right then. 2 men and 1 woman. The woman they both loved, and an awkward magnetic field of forces pulling them together and pushing them apart. Natalie couldn't see any way to resist doing what her child had begged her to do. It was hard for a child to understand the affairs of adults. So Natalie exhaled deeply and prepared to bandage Bryce's wounds. When Ronald saw Natalie attending to Bryce, he was so angry that he left the ward. His face was gloomy. He hadn't gone there to witness how intimate Natalie and Bryce were. He was feeling rebuffed and annoyed. Watching Ronald leave angrily like this, Bryce couldn't help but smile, and his heart was filled with pleasure. Someone wins and someone loses. That's the way it always has to be, right? Bryce thought, and figured that Natalie really cared about him, and not Ronald. Bryce smiled confidently, allowing Natalie's gentle hands to bandage his forehead. Natalie also registered that Ronald had left in a huff, and that made her feel a bit worried and frustrated. She was afraid that Ronald would be putting off helping Liam with the bone marrow match. If that really turned out to be the case, things could become rather difficult. While she was worrying about Liam's prospects for a cure, she carefully bandaged tightly, with a deeply wounded expression on his face. He knew that he couldn't let Natalie go so easily this time. No matter what had happened between them, Bryce wanted to hold on to Natalie's hand and bring her back to him so that they could face the future together. Bryce looked into Natalie's eyes. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, trying his best to describe his feelings for her. His face was full of worry, as he was very anxious that Natalie should properly understand him. In the days since they had parted, and ever since the two of them had become locked into this cold war, Bryce had not been happy for even a single moment. No matter what he did, his thoughts would always return to Natalie. He had not been able to concentrate on anything else. After listening to Bryce's heartfelt confession, Natalie's expression remained cold. But even though she didn't have much of an expression on her face, underneath the surface, her heart was a mess. Natalie didn't say anything for a long time, but just kept on struggling to get her hand free of Bryce's. Eventually, though, she met his gaze and spoke. "So what if you're sad? So what if you miss me? There is no possibility of any future together for us." That was the first time that Bryce had really revealed his true feelings to her. But now Natalie was rejecting him. No one knew how Natalie felt after she finished her sentence. It was as if she couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and she had been sunk into endless fear. Bryce's pitiful expression was like a thorn that pierced her heart, and Natalie felt powerless. Bryce's expression, meanwhile, was one of extreme grief. He felt that Natalie's response was extremely unfair to him. "Why is that there's no possibility of a future for us?" he gasped. Natalie turned her head away with a look of utter devastation on her features. Seeing Natalie like this, Bryce's heart sank. "Because of Liam," Natalie whispered. It felt strange to say this out loud. Although she still loved Bryce, Natalie had always been at a loss about how to get over the problem of Liam and his father. Why are there so many dilemmas in the world? Whatever choice I make would cause pain to someone, she thought, feeling dejected. "Why can't we face this problem together?" Bryce asked desperately. "I can treat Liam as my own child, and I will love you both dearly, and I will do all that I can to find a way to cure Liam's illness. I just hope that you won't push me away." He had now abandoned all attempts to maintain his own dignity. In the eyes of outsiders, he was a high and mighty person. But now, faced with losing Natalie forever, he was like a child afraid of being abandoned. Even if Liam wasn't his own son, Bryce didn't care. He would still treat him sincerely. But now he was afraid that Natalie would leave him and reject all possibility of love existing between them. But Natalie, it seemed, would rather rely on Ronald. "What else can I do? Ronald is Liam's father, after all," she thought inside. "Bryce, Ronald may be the only chance I have of saving Liam from the sickness that's ravaging him. No one else can help. Only Liam's biological father. And I can't delay this any longer. Let me ask you, why should a child as young as Liam suffer from this disease? Why shouldn't Liam be allowed to live? Why shouldn't Liam be as cheerful and free as his peers? I have to find a cure." Natalie was a little excited, especially as she was saying all this in front of Liam. She panted heavily as tears streamed down her face. Natalie's mental defenses had collapsed. On one side of her was Liam, and on the other side was Bryce. How am I going to make this choice? No matter what I choose, it was impossible for me to avoid hurting someone. It seems that I can only feel heartache over and over again, she thought, feeling depressed. Looking at Natalie's crying face, Bryce felt especially sorrowful. Sometimes it was said that it was impossible for two people who love each other to be together. Previously, Bryce hadn't believed this, but now Bryce's certainty and confidence faltered. Even if they loved each other, maybe that wouldn't be enough to resist the external pressures that the world was putting on them. Ultimately, Liam's illness was the reason why they couldn't be together. Natalie had broken Bryce when she told him that there was probably no possibility of any love between the two of them due to Liam. Bryce couldn't bear to look at Natalie's expression.
What did I do wrong? Maybe it would have been me taking Natalie by the hand and leading a happy life. He wondered longingly. However, in this world, ifs and maybes count for nothing. Anything can happen. But it doesn't mean things will always be good. Fate loves to make fools out of people, deceiving them and hurting their feelings. Fate arranges for you to meet someone, arranges for you to fall in love with them, and then prevents you from getting what you want by breaking you apart. Fate is cruel. Bryce's life before he met Natalie had been rich and interesting, and he hadn't felt bad at all. But everything had changed after he had met Natalie and got to know her. Now his days would be filled with sunshine if he saw Natalie. If he didn't see her for a few days, his life would be shrouded in darkness. Bryce didn't want his life to be like that. But he had no other choice. That was how it was. I just wanted to hear you say that you love me,
Bryce said with his eyes closed. He had hoped that being in love meant that they could choose to live together regardless of the consequences, rather than weighing the pros and cons before deciding. He had always hoped that love would ultimately be the decisive factor. If love could conquer all, then everything could change. Hearing Bryce's sincerity and heartbreak as he said this, Natalie threw herself into his arms and sobbed.
I love you, she said.
Yes, I do, but... Natalie couldn't hide her feelings for Bryce any longer, no matter how hard she tried. Every time she deceived herself, she had to endure the pain of self-deception. But Liam's illness meant that she couldn't delay. No one could blame her for that. If they had to blame someone, they should blame fate for arranging Ronald as Liam's biological father.
It was all so unfair. Given a forced choice between Liam and Bryce, Natalie could only choose Liam. Bryce covered Natalie's mouth with his own, kissing her tenderly and letting his actions speak for him. Natalie kissed him back passionately. Their passion and love were like the water that had broken through a dam. It was as if time had stopped, and both of them slowly enjoyed the simple warmth of shared love. It felt desperate, as though they might never get a chance to be like this in the future. Bryce only wanted one thing. If he could prove that Natalie really loved him, then he would be satisfied. Then everything that he had done would have been worth it after all. It was only at this moment that the two of them had finally broken through the final barriers of reserve and pride that had been keeping them apart. They had finally revealed their true feelings, and they were no longer trying to hurt each other or deny what they felt. "I don't want to leave you, but there's nothing else I can do," Natalie gasped. In saying this, Natalie revealed the secret that she had been holding in her heart. She felt relieved of a burden, and she felt more comfortable. "I know," whispered Bryce. "Let me try and think of a way out." Knowing that she loved him, Bryce was suddenly filled with renewed power and confidence. All he wanted was Natalie's heart to be joined with his. No matter what happened, as long as he knew that Natalie loved him, Bryce wouldn't care about anything else. Natalie spoke again. "Before our Cold War, I was unhappy too. And I know that you secretly came to see Liam. But it still seemed that my only option was to force you away, for Liam's sake." Liam lay there on his sickbed all this while. While Bryce and Natalie had been talking, Liam lay there silently, trying to blend into the background and make himself invisible. Even though he was only a child, Liam understood that something very important and complicated was going on between Mommy and Bryce. When he heard their confessions and saw their kisses, he immediately wanted to hide. But at the same time, he still secretly rejoiced in his heart. It seemed that Mommy and Bryce might be able to get along after all. That was his dream. Liam's face flushed with happiness. He couldn't help but think that his heartfelt wish for Natalie and Bryce to be together might actually be fulfilled. He had been able to tell that something was wrong, but now it was as if the sun had come out on a gloomy day and brightened everything up again. While Bryce and Natalie were still deep in each other's embrace, Liam sneaked out of the ward. Along the way, he also told all the nurses and related people to come out of the ward and leave his mom and dad on their own. He wanted to give them the best chance of making up for their differences. Natalie was completely mesmerized by Bryce's words and didn't even notice that Liam was no longer in the room. On the other hand, Bryce had seen Liam leave quietly, and when Bryce had gestured to him to stop, that little devil Liam had actually winked at him. If Liam really was his child, then Bryce would almost die of happiness. Although Bryce was worried that Liam might not be safe if he went out alone, he felt relieved when he remembered that there was a nurse outside who would look after Liam. So Bryce didn't chase after him, but instead continued to talk to Natalie. He brought up the topic of Liam with her. "Isn't Liam the real person why you're together with Ronald? And since both of us are interested in doing what's best for Liam, why don't we work together to make him happy?" What Bryce said made sense, and it wasn't like Natalie didn't understand this. However, the crucial point was that the factor that could save Liam was not under their control, so it wasn't entirely their choice what to do. They could only hope that Ronald would cooperate. Natalie didn't feel that there was anything wrong with her way of doing things. "Naturally, my first thought is for Liam," she said tetchily. "I'm constantly thinking about his well-being and about what I can do to make him well and keep him happy." It was precisely for Liam's sake that she had ended her love affair with Bryce. Wasn't that clear enough? She wondered, although she didn't give voice to these latter thoughts. "What I'm saying is that we also have to think about Liam's emotions, not just his physical well-being. If we ignore that consideration, the result won't be good," Bryce replied. Essentially, Bryce wanted Liam to be happy instead of having a sad face all day. Ever since he had received the call from Liam earlier, it had been very clear to Bryce that Liam didn't like Ronald. Liam had called Bryce without hesitation, just so that he wouldn't have to see Ronald. Natalie frowned. "Bryce, you know that you're not Liam's father. Liam is still young and knows that you treat him well, so he likes you. Loves you, actually, just as if you were his real father. But we are adults, and we each know in our hearts that there are some things that we can't control. We just have to cope with what life throws at us and get through it as best we can." Natalie said these words calmly. However, she really didn't like talking like this. She wished that she could live a carefree life and enjoy the present instead of worrying about the future. However, this aspiration was now probably impossible to achieve. Fate, genetics, and circumstances had given her a unique personality, and Natalie was afraid that it would be difficult for her to change her personality in any meaningful way. Luckily, Bryce had a different personality from Natalie's, so he wasn't discouraged after hearing Natalie's words. Instead, he continued to patiently and sincerely guide her. "Natalie, you can't think like this. We haven't clearly established the father-son relationship between Ronald and Liam yet. Moreover, we are thinking about Liam from our own point of view. Why don't we flip the picture and instead consider Liam's feelings and perspectives?" In Bryce's view, no matter what, he would not believe that Ronald was Liam's biological father. Ronald had always been a cunning person. In order to win Natalie over, he could easily have decided to just invent the story about him being Liam's father. In Bryce's view, Ronald was capable of any kind of sneaky trick. As Bryce spoke, Natalie stared at him seriously. It was clear that Natalie really hoped that Bryce could come up with an argument that would make her waver from her negative beliefs. Bryce seemed to be able to read that wish in Natalie's eyes, so he continued. "Although Liam is still young, and his mind is obviously not comparable to our adult minds, we can't deny that children have independent minds and personalities, and they also feel all kinds of emotions. They are very clear on what they want and don't want." Bryce had suddenly understood that sometimes it was really important to listen to a child's opinion. Natalie lowered her head and didn't say a word as she folded her arms. It seemed that Natalie's heart was already inclining toward Bryce's perspective on things, but her personality and habits were making it difficult for her to make a final decision, especially a decision that related to the people she really cared about. "Have you ever heard of euthanasia?" Bryce asked, suddenly changing the topic. After hearing this, Natalie was stunned. She hadn't expected Bryce to say something like that. She shook her head and started to feel disappointed. Looking at Natalie's frightened expression, Bryce naturally knew that what he had said had come out wrong. He tried to clarify. "Of course, I don't mean with regard to Liam," he said. "I'm just saying that a person's emotions and feelings are the most important thing. People at the end of life don't want electric shock devices and drugs to extend their lives. They just want to live happily every day. If they can't even do the most basic thing, then what is the true meaning of life? Is hanging on to life enough, or is the quality of that life more important?" Bryce looked at Natalie quietly, wanting to see how she responded. Sure enough, Natalie's expression changed. What Bryce had said wasn't completely unreasonable, but her feelings were selfish, especially toward Liam. Thinking about it carefully, Natalie realized that she had not really taken Liam's feelings into consideration for a long time. But now she was only focused on how to find a match for Liam's bone marrow and how to save his life. Had I done something wrong? Natalie wondered suddenly. Natalie finally raised her head and wanted to say something, but Bryce didn't give her the chance to speak. Bryce kissed her on the lips decisively. Natalie was startled by Bryce's sudden warm kiss, but her body gradually relaxed, and her brain slowly went woozy from the contact with Bryce's lips. It was a good thing that Bryce held Natalie's waist firmly, otherwise she might have fainted away. After kissing for a long time, Bryce seemed to be deeply engrossed. He closed his eyes tightly, but Natalie did not dare to close hers. Eventually, Bryce broke the kiss. He touched his injured forehead to Natalie's forehead. "Natalie," he said, "don't worry. leave everything to me."
Bryce's tone was very gentle, and his voice was very pleasant and reassuring to listen to at that moment. He was being very gentle so as to try and make Natalie relax a little in the stressful situation they had all found themselves in. Bryce hoped that his beloved woman could be happy and that she would not worry too much about this matter. If possible, he hoped that Natalie would trust him and rely on him. But Natalie was still frowning as she thought about something. "Bryce, I'm afraid that Ronald will be angered if I reject him. What if he decides that he doesn't want to help save Liam at all?" This was the most important thing. Liam's health was much more precious than anything else. Natalie wasn't hesitating because she had any feelings for Ronald, but because she was afraid that she would lose the best chance to save Liam. Could I live with the guilt of that? She wondered. However, in Bryce's eyes, Natalie was worrying unnecessarily. Although Ronald hated Bryce to the bones, and he was not a righteous man, Ronald still had some dignity and human compassion. Whatever the bad feeling between Bryce and Ronald, that would not affect Ronald's desire to help a sick little boy. Or so Bryce believed. But it was true that Ronald wanted Natalie to be with him, not only because Natalie was Bryce's woman, which was why he wanted to steal her, but also because Ronald loved Natalie as well. Bryce wasn't worried at all. Maybe Ronald was not the only one who could save Liam's life. And furthermore, they didn't know yet if Ronald's blood type was even compatible with Liam's. After all, Bryce had suspected from the very beginning that Ronald was not actually Liam's father. "Natalie," said Bryce, "I will settle this issue with Ronald personally. You don't have to worry. Liam will definitely regain his health, one way or another. I know that Liam can't wait to educate his future brother or sister, and that means he will have a very strong desire to get well." Bryce smiled and looked at Natalie's baby bump. Seeing Bryce looking at her like that, Natalie immediately became shy. She lightly punched Bryce's shoulder and rebuked him. "What are you thinking of? I'm dying of anxiety here, and now you're joking around." As she spoke, Natalie's eyes reddened with tears. She wasn't in the mood for jokes right then. With so many troubles confronting them, the slightest carelessness could lead to an irreparable outcome. Seeing that the situation was not going well, Bryce reached out and pulled Natalie into his arms, stroking her shoulders gently. He sighed. "Natalie, people have to go through a lot of things in their lives. We can only go step by step, so we have to take things one day at a time. We don't need to worry about things that might never happen. After all, we still have to walk a long road together." He looked off into the distance as if the future was right there and visible to him. He seemed to picture the two of them living together, walking side by side along the road of life. Bryce's words moved Natalie. There was not a single mention of love in what he said, but his words had still touched her heart. The greater Bryce's sincerity, the more pressure Natalie felt to make a final decision about what to do. If she wanted to do it, she could selfishly abandon Bryce and save Liam's life. But since Bryce was so good to her, Natalie was very reluctant to abandon their relationship and the possibilities of happiness that it held for their future life together. The thought of parting from him filled her heart with bitterness. "But Bryce," she said hopelessly, "if I want to save Liam's life, I can only rely on Ronald's blood matching his. Otherwise, we can't do anything to save him. For Liam's sake, I am willing to do anything, even if it means abandoning you." Natalie said this in grief and not with willingness. She didn't even dare to look Bryce in the eye. She felt truly powerless, driven by fate and misfortune. Natalie cried helplessly. Only by agreeing to be with Ronald would she guarantee that there was a possibility of saving Liam. But to do that, she would have to abandon Bryce, and their possibility of a life together would be destroyed. Liam, meanwhile, was waiting outside obediently, listening to what Natalie and Bryce had been saying. When he'd heard Natalie say that the three of them couldn't be together, Liam immediately rushed into the ward. He looked at the two adults and burst into tears. It was a pitiful sight to behold. "I want the three of us to be together," he wailed. "All the other kids have loving parents, so why can't I have them?
Tears streamed down his face uncontrollably. When Natalie saw Liam's pitiful appearance, her heart melted. "Hush, Liam. Oh, please don't cry," she said, breaking away from Bryce's embrace and running toward Liam. She took him in her arms and comforted him as best she could. When Natalie heard Liam sobbing, she became confused and didn't know what to do. She could only feel pain in her heart. Liam continued to wail. "I don't want the two of you to separate. If you separate, then what's the use of curing my illness?" The expression on his little face was especially pitiful. Bryce could see that Liam didn't need gifts or toys. He just needed his disease cured. What could be done? Bryce wondered. Hearing Liam talk about not being cured, the two adults immediately changed their expressions. They were afraid that Liam might do something silly, but Liam was only thinking about the relationship between his parents. "Liam, what nonsense are you talking about?" Natalie said. "You must receive the treatment that the doctors prescribe. We have all tried so hard on your behalf. So if you don't listen obediently to what people recommend to you, then all our efforts will have been in vain." Natalie frowned, feeling a bit at a loss as to what to do. But Liam persisted in his complaint. "But I want Dad to be with us. If I recover from my illness, but I can't see Dad anymore, what's the point of me being cured?" Liam spoke sadly but energetically, as if he hadn't taken Natalie's words seriously at all. Hearing Liam's resolute words, she finally understood what Bryce had been getting at earlier, the idea that people don't want to live in a world of pain. If Liam felt that there was something more important than his life, then who was I to stop him from pursuing his goal? She thought suddenly. Natalie seemed to understand everything better all of a sudden. Although her heart was in pain, the world before her eyes was crystal clear. Sometimes letting nature take its course might be a better way to proceed. But Liam, seeing that his mother was frowning and obviously not agreeing with him, continued crying and complaining. "I want Dad! And I want Dad and Mom! I want the three of us to be together!" Liam hadn't really been one for crying when he was young. What was different now, and what was making him sad, was that his dad and mom couldn't be together. Liam's heart had always been biased in favor of Bryce, who would often come to see him at the hospital alone without telling Natalie. Liam was especially upset to see that there was a rift between his parents. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to live in the family unit that he wanted to. If it turned out like that, he would rather not be cured. Bryce sat on the bed with his heart full of bitterness. He was upset that Liam was willing to risk his life to say that he didn't want to be treated on account of Natalie and Bryce not being able to be together. Bryce hated this situation. Liam was such a good kid, and he was smart for his age too, and when he would grow up, his prospects would be limitless. Bryce wanted Liam to be healthy and safe, regardless of whether Liam was his own child or not. "Liam," he said, "please listen to us. Your mom has done so much for you. Don't waste her efforts, and please don't cause her any more heartache. Besides, your disease will be cured, and our family of three will definitely live happily together." Bryce looked at Liam seriously as he made this vow. After hearing what his dad said, Liam hesitated. "Is that true?" he asked hopefully. "Will the three of us be able to be together?" A serious expression surfaced on Liam's face. He had to get a definite answer to his question in order to be able to relax. Bryce nodded solemnly. "Yes, it's true. I would never lie to you. If I say that we will be together, we will definitely be together." Bryce looked at Liam seriously, as if the two of them had just agreed on a contract. Liam's crying face brightened. This was the answer that he had most wanted to hear. As long as his dad and mom were together, everything would be fine. He nodded happily, and his heart calmed down. "Okay, I believe you, Dad." Emotional states are infectious. Seeing Liam stop crying and start to smile, Natalie also felt less sad.
However, she felt a little awkward about the promise that Bryce had casually made to Liam. Wouldn't it be all the more disappointing for Liam if that promise couldn't be delivered on? She wondered. Natalie stared at Bryce. He looked tired all of a sudden. "Bryce?" she said doubtfully. "How can I not be worried about his promise to Liam, given all the uncertainties that we are facing? Even though I know that I am lucky to have such a good man who loved me so much," she wondered. Bryce asked, waiting for Natalie to continue. He had a feeling that Natalie would not be willing to abandon him. "Why do you look so tired?" Natalie asked, unable to conceal her concern. "I've probably got a cold," Bryce replied unconvincingly. He didn't want to burden Natalie, but the truth was that he had been suffering because the two of them had been on bad terms for such a long time until then. And on top of that, he had been brought low when she had chosen Ronald over him. Natalie's brows knitted in worry. "If you can't even take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of me and Liam?" she asked, as her voice was unsteady with tears. Even though Bryce was a man who could move heaven and earth in Natalie's view, he also needed someone to take care of him and love him. "What do you mean?" Bryce asked. Thinking about Natalie's words, he immediately guessed at her veiled meaning. She meant that she wanted him to take care of her and Liam in the future. Then Natalie spoke again. "Our family of 3 should be together for the rest of our lives." These romantic words had finally come out of her mouth. Natalie now felt that nothing was more important than them sticking together. Even Liam's illness didn't mean that she had to be with Ronald. If Ronald didn't accept this, then she would work hard to find another suitable match for Liam's medical needs. It was impossible that Ronald was the only person in the world who was a suitable match. Bryce's eyes became brighter and brighter as he repeated what Natalie said just then. "Yes, we will be together for the rest of our lives." This made his heart more determined. He would definitely protect the 2 people that he loved. Then Bryce seemed to suddenly think of something. "I want to take the matching test to see if my blood and bone marrow is a match to Liam's. Somehow I feel that Liam and I are fated to be together. Maybe we might be compatible, even if the 2 of us aren't related." He looked over at Natalie with fresh hope in his eyes. Bryce had expressed his desire to take the matching test to see if his and Liam's blood and bone marrow were a match. He was suddenly optimistic, feeling that Liam and he were fated to be together, and hoping that they might be compatible enough, though the 2 of them weren't related. Bryce's face was now full of pride and confidence. His line of thinking was that if his blood matched Liam's, then all of their problems would be solved. "Yes, you can certainly give it a try," Natalie encouraged him. The room was filled with a sense of warmth and hope as the 3 of them stood, looking at each other, filled with a new hope. Outside the ward, the corridor was cold and chilly. Ronald had left the ward earlier with plans to buy Liam some gifts. He had hoped that this gesture would please the little boy and make him feel more positive toward Ronald, thus easing the awkward relationship between the 2 of them. However, when he returned to the ward, he saw the family of 3 standing like a holy triptych and felt a stinging sensation of jealousy in his heart. He'd also heard what Bryce had just said. If they were going to check for a match with Liam, wouldn't that mean that they would notice? No, he thought. This can't be allowed to happen. Natalie, he began, stepping forward and entering the ward, thus interrupting their cozy scene. But then he suddenly noticed the blissful expression on Natalie's face. He halted immediately. It was as if his feet were suddenly plated with lead, making it impossible for him to move. Ronald had never seen this sort of expression on her face. Whenever Natalie had been with him, her face had always shown an expression that was steeped with the pessimism of someone who had experienced many vicissitudes in life. Perhaps only Bryce could evoke this kind of happiness in her, Ronald wondered, feeling dejected. Ronald had done everything that he could to please, bribe, and even threaten her, but he still hadn't been able to touch Natalie's heart. Even if I manage to possess Natalie's body, I will never be able to take possession of her heart, Ronald realized. Whatever.
he muttered to himself as his heart filled with bitterness. The relationship that I'm trying to cultivate with Natalie is probably not right for me or for her to begin with. Or else what other reason could have caused it to turn out like this time and again? Having pursued the goal of winning Natalie's heart for so long, maybe I felt that will only end up causing myself a lot of unnecessary trouble if I maintain my pursuit of her despite everything. Maybe what does not belong to me will always remain beyond my grasp. And maybe I should have been wise enough to understand this fact long ago. Liam, Bryce, and Natalie are a happy family of 3 while I'm just an outsider. And anyway, I can't bear to see Natalie unhappy.
Ronald pondered on all this and finally concluded this way. Sighing with resignation, he silently walked out of the hospital, still holding the things that he had bought in hopes of bribing Liam.
What was the point of all this? In the end, what Liam wants is what he thinks Bryce can give him. Sure enough, Liam is Natalie's son, and neither of them like me. Not really,
Ronald concluded, although he could not pacify the pain of his unreciprocated feelings. Ronald went home alone. On the way home, he thought about many things. When he entered his house and then upstairs, he glanced at Natalie's picture, which was still on his bedside table. In the photo, she was laughing heartily. Her beautiful smile was as fresh as the first time that he had ever seen it.
Natalie has a beautiful smile. But her smile sadly doesn't bestow any gifts or pleasure on me. Unfortunately, I have to admit that I haven't seen Natalie smile in a long time. Perhaps Natalie can never really be happy with me. And what I had been doing, pursuing her, made no sense at all.
Ronald pondered as he came to terms with the reality. Ronald's heart was filled with bitterness. He decided to go and drink some wine to ease his worries. He called his best friend and arranged to meet so that they could relax his mind and maybe free his soul. The two of them met at a bar not far from Ronald's home. There were all sorts of people in the bar. Some of them had come there to get drunk because of their work or family pressures, while some others were there because they wanted to amuse themselves or meet people whom they liked. Ronald hoped to use alcohol to ease his worries and improve his mood. He didn't want to admit that he had lost his beloved woman when she threw herself into the arms of another man, but a strong sense of powerlessness overwhelmed him, as if he had a hat on that said "loser" on it. As soon as they entered the bar, Ronald told the waiter to bring them a lot of alcohol, the strongest and the best. Seeing that Ronald was going to use alcohol to ease his worries, his friend Peter was stunned.
"What's happened to you, Ronald?" he asked. "Did you have another bust up with Natalie?"
Peter hadn't seen Ronald in this kind of a mood before, and he was somewhat perplexed. Ronald didn't say anything, but just continued to down alcohol, one glass after another. There in the bar, everyone was equal. No one knew each other, and they were together only for a short time. Once they left the bar, everyone would continue to live their sad and lonely lives. But for the moment, Ronald felt that he could lose himself in alcohol, and as a consequence, everything would be happy and painless. Seeing his friend silently guzzling booze without restraint, Peter's face assumed a helpless expression. He had never thought that Ronald, who was now getting stinking drunk in the bar, would actually behave like this. Ronald had a handsome face, a proud spirit, and the advantage of being very rich. However, now he looked just like any other miserable drunk as he miserably downed glass after glass of booze.
"What's the matter with you?" Peter asked. "Why are you so dejected?"
He had been friends with Ronald for many years, and this was the first time that he had seen his friend look extremely dejected and despondent.
"I'm fine,"
Ronald said, without even looking at his friend. Ronald was clearly not in a good mood at the moment, and he didn't want to talk his problems through, it seemed. He just wanted to drown them. Ronald continued to drink, desperately trying to numb his feelings.
"So it's not just sadness. There's also anger eating him up inside,"
Peter thought, looking at Ronald. As Ronald's bosom friend, Peter was able to guess what had happened to Ronald. A sad affair of the heart.
"Get lost! Get lost!"
Ronald impatiently muttered at Peter, drunkenly irritated with the way his friend was asking him questions.
"Right now, I just want to drink in peace and not care about anything else. I asked Peter to come along just to accompany me while I drink. not to discuss my personal affairs," Ronald thought, feeling annoyed about Peter's concern. Peter frowned. "You know that it's useless to try and use alcohol to dispel your worries, right?" he bluntly pointed out, concerned that Ronald would only make things worse for himself if he sought answers for his troubles at the bottom of a glass. As he said this, he patted Ronald on the shoulder to try and comfort him. But Ronald was by then pretty drunk. Resting his head on his arms on the table, Ronald had almost become unconscious from drinking. He couldn't make out what Peter was saying to him, so he mumbled something in response. He seemed to be unhappy, and his brows were knitted together tightly. "Why bother to keep trying? I'm so tired," Ronald muttered, closing his eyes. It wasn't clear if he was talking to himself or his friend. He was drunk, yet at the same time, he spoke of these things as if he was sober. Everything that he said was related to something deep within his heart that he wanted to explore. Peter sat there, helplessly listening to all this. As a confidant, he could only silently comfort Ronald. He knew everything about Ronald and Natalie. Everything, right from the beginning. "Drink some water, Ronald," Peter urged. "Drinking this much booze is bad for you." He kindly handed Ronald a glass of water. Drinking alcohol to allay away sorrow, he knew, will only lead you to feel worse and increase the burdens on your body. After a night of numbness, you will wake up with a hangover and just feel even worse than before. Ronald picked up the glass of water and drank it without thinking. He couldn't taste anything he was putting in his mouth by then anyway. He looked into the distance with wounded eyes. "Tell me, Peter, is it worth persevering for so long? The water seems to have diluted the alcohol a bit. Why else would my heart feel like it's aching more and more?" Ronald wondered and concluded. Peter put another glass of water in Ronald's hand and spoke. "At the beginning, I had advised you to work hard to win Natalie's heart, warning you that you might otherwise regret not trying, but now I don't think so. Since you said that Natalie and Bryce seem very happy together, I think that it's better you give it up." He looked at Ronald with concern, giving him what he thought was the best, most sincere advice. "As the saying goes, Ronald, a melon that is forcefully twisted is not sweet. If you insist on forcing Natalie to be with you, then the two of you will definitely not be happy." Peter didn't show any impatience on his face. In order to help Ronald, he tried to think about what was best for his friend. "Every time that Ronald had met me with any trouble over Natalie in the past, my advice had helped Ronald find a way forward. But is it easy for Ronald to hear his friend tell him to give up on Natalie? No, love is stubborn after all," Peter concluded, pondering as he spoke to his bosom friend. "But why shouldn't I get what I want?" Ronald cried. He wanted to get drunk to forget about everything. But even though he was now good and drunk, all he could think about still were his sorrows as they related to Natalie. "I know that even if Natalie chose to stay with me, it would only be because she wanted to save Liam's life, and not because she loves me. If there was nothing wrong with Liam's health, then there would have been no possibility of Natalie and I being together, let alone of me getting Natalie's attention." All of this had suddenly become perfectly clear to Ronald tonight, clarifying through the haze of his drunkenness. "How pathetic," he thought. Peter sighed and went on. "Love is a strange thing. Everything about it depends on fate. You love her, but she doesn't feel the same way about you, and that means that the two of you aren't destined to be together." Peter seemed like he had been through a lot of things and experienced a lot of emotions in his life. At that moment, he was comforting Ronald like a caring big brother. He hoped that he could help Ronald see things clearly and find a way through for a solution to his troubles. Love just wasn't enough sometimes. If you can't succeed, no matter how hard you try, then it sometimes means that the time isn't right for you. Sometimes giving up is the best thing to do, Peter thought, feeling bad for his dear friend. Ronald shook his head. "Natalie is the first person to touch my heart like this in many years. Can I really give up after persevering for her for so long?" His face was full of sadness, but no one knew just how heartbroken Ronald really was at that point. "Every frown and smile of Natalie's is deeply imprinted in my mind. Every word that she has said to me seems to have melted into my flesh and blood. How can I give up so easily? He thought, feeling sad and silly. Peter sighed. But think about Bryce and her. They've been together for a long time, and that time means as much to them as your time with Natalie means to you. That makes it clear that they have a deep relationship with each other. If Natalie is forced to choose between the two of you, and it causes pain to both of them, as well as you, then that will mean that all three of you will be living in pain. So what's the point of persevering like that? Why not give up as soon as possible and give all three of you a chance to find happiness, instead of going on with this continual tug of war? Peter gazed into the distance as if he had understood the philosophy of love. The simplest principle was actually to think about other people's feelings, and not just about yourself. Love sometimes consists of seeing people who love each other be happy together, even if you are not happy. That can be worthwhile. Ronald nodded slowly. You're right. It's true that I can't bear to see her unhappy. Perhaps only Bryce can bring her true happiness. If I really love her, then I should let her go. Ronald's heart was filled with bitterness. He laid his head down on the table as if he was crying. It was clear, even to him, that Natalie and Bryce were made for each other, although he was reluctant to admit defeat, and he believed that he was not inferior in any way to Bryce as a man. Peter smiled. Take your time to think it through, Ronald. Losing a relationship is a big blow, but maybe it's for the best after all. Perhaps in a week or so you'll be able to start forgetting about her and hopefully move on. Well, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em, Peter thought as he picked up a glass of wine and drank. Ronald kept repeating the same thing to himself. It will be fine. It will be fine. The bar was noisy. Some people were happy, while others were miserable. But life continued anyway. No matter what happened today, people would put their lives back together tomorrow and continue to live. Not many people break so completely that they can't go on. Ronald was slumped forward on the table, his mind full of thoughts. Thinking of Natalie's happy smile in the photo on his bedside table, he wondered whether he should, perhaps, tell Natalie the truth. That is, tell her that Bryce was really Liam's father. Bryce and Natalie should have been together long before now. Despite all the difficulties that they had gone through, they were still the most suitable people for each other. Bryce's blood type, Ronald knew, was compatible with Liam's, and Ronald would not have been able to save Liam anyway. The new day brought a cooler wind, and when it blew on Ronald's skin, he felt a horrible chill that made him shiver. He was badly hungover, and his heart was filled with a sense of desolation. After the previous night's drunken revelations, he seemed to have understood a lot. For instance, it turned out that when you truly loved someone, all you wanted to do was see them smile and hope for them to fulfill their wish to live a happy life. Ronald had thought that he could give Natalie happiness through his love for her. However, he saw now that this had just been wishful thinking on his part. Another moment of clarity from last night had helped him realize that the only reason that Bryce had been reluctant to kill him was probably because Bryce had thought that Ronald was Liam's biological father. Moreover, since Bryce got together with Natalie, he seems to have lost a lot of his hostility. But all the same, Bryce's methods are something I can't compete with. Thinking about this, Ronald felt relieved. After battling with Bryce for so long, maybe it was time to end our rivalry. I no longer really care about who wins or loses. After all, seeing what Bryce did for Natalie, I no longer believe that I can do such things for her myself. I have too many other concerns, whereas Bryce is entirely focused on Natalie, Ronald concluded. Just by that measure alone, Ronald realized that he had put himself on the losing side, at a massive disadvantage. Although he didn't really want to let Bryce win, he knew that he had been really lucky to meet a woman like Natalie. And now, when all was said and done, Ronald chose to help Bryce and Natalie. Ronald was a bit dizzy from all the alcohol last night. He propped himself up in his bed and shook his head slowly. Just then, the phone beside him suddenly rang. When he saw the familiar name on the caller ID screen, the corner of Ronald's mouth curved up in a smile. So, it's finally time, he thought. Ronald picked up the phone, and Natalie's slightly anxious voice sounded from the speaker. Ronald, it's me. Can we talk? Talk properly sometime? Even though Ronald had known that it was Natalie who was calling, his heart still skipped a beat when he heard her voice. Natalie, of course, no problem. How about meeting up at noon today? He asked as he pursed his lips and tried to sound casual. Natalie seemed to heave a long sigh of relief. Okay, that's fine. Today, noon it is. Ronald grunted before hanging up the phone. Natalie turned to Bryce. Bryce, do you think that Ronald will agree to our terms? And what do we do if he doesn't agree? Natalie sounded worried. She and Bryce had discussed things last night, and Bryce had decided to give Ronald a 50% share in the Claire group in exchange for Ronald's bone marrow donation for Liam. Natalie was shocked by Bryce's decision and was hardly able to believe it. I already owe a lot to Bryce. How can I allow him to give up so much on my behalf? A 50% share of the Claire group was a huge amount of money, and the benefits that Ronald would accrue were priceless. What right do I have to ask Bryce to make such a sacrifice? She had thought, feeling as though Bryce's offer was absolutely unreasonable to even consider. However, she couldn't change Bryce's mind about this, and Liam's situation was really critical, so she had no other choice. In the end, Natalie realized that she owed Bryce a lot. I see no way of me ever being able to repay my debt to him in money. Not ever, she concluded. Natalie's concerned words brought Bryce and his thoughts back to reality. She was looking at Bryce nervously, trying to get him to show her some warmth. Otherwise, she felt that she would not be able to hold on any longer. Bryce remained calm, gently holding Natalie in his arms and consoling her. Everything will be all right, Natalie. Don't worry. Ronald will surely accept such a generous offer. Moreover, outdoing the Claire group has always been his goal. And anyway, if he doesn't accept the offer, I'll beat him up until he does. Natalie burst into laughter at this. Then she let out a long sigh. Bryce, this offer represents half of the Claire family's wealth. How can you joke about it in such a relaxed manner? That money is the foundation of the Claire family. How do you think the patriarch, old Jefferson Claire, will react? Surely he'll go crazy with anger, right? The more she thought about this, the more guilty she felt. She felt that she was dragging Bryce down. But Bryce didn't seem to care at all, as though the shares of the Claire group meant nothing to him. In the end, he just shook his head indifferently. Natalie, compared to the value that you and Liam hold in my life, money means nothing. Even if I lose it, I would still find a way to make more. But if I lose you or Liam, I would really lose everything that matters to me, because you both can't be replaced. When have I ever known Bryce to have an emotional side like this? Natalie thought, feeling touched, as her face turned slightly red. The two of them quietly embraced each other. Neither of them spoke, although a lot was being communicated between them. It seemed that they were in agreement about this. In the blink of an eye, it was already noon. Natalie and Bryce had prepared a private room and were quietly waiting for Ronald to arrive. Because she was worried that Ronald would go back on his word and wouldn't turn up, Natalie didn't dare to call him again to urge him to hurry, even though Ronald was already late. Half an hour later, Ronald walked in slowly. Seeing Natalie sitting there with Bryce, Ronald's eyes flashed a little. But when they indicated that Ronald should sit down opposite them, he remained calm and collected. When Natalie saw Ronald act this way, she felt that he had changed somehow. However, she couldn't tell what exactly had changed about him. The three of them sat there quietly for a moment. The atmosphere was a little awkward. Natalie had thought of countless arguments to make last night, but now she suddenly found that she didn't know what to say. She was truly nervous. In the end, Bryce was the first to break the silence. Ronald, since you're here, let me tell you about our intentions. I'll go straight to the point. Ronald raised his eyebrows and waited, finding himself interested to hear Bryce's words. Bryce cleared his throat and began. As you know, Natalie is my wife, and she is the woman that I love. The first thing to say, is that you can't have any more ideas about having a relationship with her. That's non-negotiable. Otherwise, provided that you agree to donate your bone marrow to Liam, I'll accept any other conditions that you have." When Ronald heard this, his eyes, which had previously been calm, lit up. He looked with interest at the two people in front of him. "Oh? What conditions? I'm curious, so why don't you tell me more about what you're proposing?" he asked. When Natalie saw that Ronald didn't seem all that concerned about Liam's well-being, her face became pale, and the coldness in her heart intensified. This man says that he is Liam's biological father, and yet he seems more concerned with his own interests than whether Liam lives or dies, Natalie thought, fuming with anger. But I must concentrate on the matter at hand, she realized, trying to organize her thoughts. She sighed. "Ronald, we're doing our best here, so please don't go overboard with your jokes." But Ronald didn't seem concerned in the slightest. He turned around and looked at Bryce. "Bryce, is this the sincerity that you put out? I don't think so." Bryce had an unusually ugly expression on his face. "Ronald, I've already said that I can agree to any condition that you specify. Just tell us what you want," he snorted coldly. Seeing that Bryce didn't seem to be joking, Ronald couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Having fought with me for so long, Bryce knows what I want the most right now. But could it be that Natalie is more important to Bryce than everything else? Ronald wondered, pondering his conditions. Thinking about that, Ronald was filled with doubt. He couldn't help but speak provocatively to Bryce. "Okay, I'll assume that what you said is true, although it's hard to believe it, coming as it does from a man like you. Here's my condition. You give me 50% of the shares in the Claire Group, and I'll consider donating my bone marrow to save Liam." His eyes were twinkling with pleasure as he said this. "All right," Bryce said immediately. "I can agree to that." When Ronald heard Bryce's positive reply given so quickly, he was extremely surprised. After all, he had only stated that condition as a way of testing the water to see how far Bryce might be prepared to bargain with him. He hadn't thought that Bryce would agree to his demand without even seeming to think about it. 50% of the Claire Group assets is a huge amount of money, and yet Bryce seems prepared to give me all of this for a woman and her child? That's simply unbelievable. Thinking about this, Ronald, who was pretending to be calm, felt confused, excited, and nervous all at the same time. He didn't know how to respond yet. The longer Ronald remained silent, the more nervous Natalie felt. She cleared her throat. "Ronald, come on. This is Bryce's limit, so don't push him too far. Bryce had already paid a lot for this, and I really can't let him get any deeper into it," she thought, panicking over Ronald's delay in responding. Ronald's thoughts gradually returned to reality as he took in what Natalie had said, and he laughed. "Natalie, I didn't expect you to think that I'm a greedy, vile person." Suddenly, there was a deep sadness in his eyes, so deep that Natalie couldn't even look at him. Natalie calmly looked away. "Isn't it true enough, considering everything that you've done? Why wouldn't I come to that conclusion about you?" Such a simple sentence, and yet it was like an arrow through Ronald's heart. He felt so heartbroken that he could hardly catch his breath. He clenched his fists tightly to prevent his emotions from showing. Then he raised his head and looked at Natalie and Bryce with a calm expression. "Forget it," he said, laughing lightly. "I guess I lost everything in the end, even my good name in your eyes." The meaning behind his words was unclear, causing Natalie and Bryce to feel confused. Natalie opened her mouth to ask Ronald something, but before she could speak, he unexpectedly took out a document from his bag and gently put it on the table in front of them. "Bryce," he said, "don't worry. I won't take that 50% of the shares. I want to outdo the Claire Group, but the point for me is that I have to work hard to overcome you. I don't want it handed to me on a plate." Seeing the puzzled look on Bryce's face, Ronald continued, "Look at this document, will you? This will give you guys what you want, a way to save Liam. This is where I have to admit that I lied to you, Natalie. I'm not Liam's father. I don't have that privilege, unfortunately." Natalie had a shocked expression on her face then. She stared at Ronald wide-eyed. "What exactly do you mean by that? If you're not Liam's biological father, then who is?" she demanded. She really felt confused and upset right then. She felt that she was about to collapse. Why does fate keep teasing me like this? She wondered, feeling dejected once more. Ronald, still smiling, did not answer Natalie's question directly. Instead, his gaze landed on the document that he had just put down on the table. "The answer you need," he said, "is written very clearly in this document. And it will save Liam." He looked at them with an amused look in his eyes before continuing. "Bryce, you are indeed stronger than me in many ways. However, you were more focused on Natalie than I was, so you missed things that I discovered." Ronald spoke, referring to the reason why he had found out who Liam's biological father was, while Bryce had not. In Bryce's eyes, the more he cared about something, the more carefully he protected it and focused on it, meaning that he sometimes lost sight of the bigger picture. With Ronald's words, Bryce and Natalie suddenly seemed to understand something, and their eyes lit up. Natalie was anxious to take a look at the document, but Ronald stopped her. "Promise me that after I leave, it won't be too late for you to wait any longer." These words accompanied a sense of pleading and hope. When Natalie saw this expression on his face, she looked at him with a new understanding. "Even though I know that Ronald has done many bad deeds, I still can't bring myself to hate him," she realized. The new day